My guest today is Zack Allen, a seasoned security research, engineering, and product leader with over a decade of experience in building organizations that create impactful security for customers. Zack specializes in threat research and intelligence, cloud security, software engineering, and DevOps. His expertise has significantly contributed to the advancement of the field of cybersecurity. He is also the visionary behind Detection Engineering Weekly, a platform that provides insights and updates on the latest in detection engineering. Thanks so much for being with us on the show today, Zack. It's a real honor to have you.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I appreciate it.
I meant every word of it.
Yeah.
Before we get into it, do you want to tell us a little bit about your newsletter, Detection Engineering Weekly?
Sure. Yeah. So Detection Engineering Weekly is a Substack newsletter I started 77 weeks ago or around that amount of time. I only know that because of the issue numbers, so it's not like anything fancy. But the basic premise behind it is, we're all really invested in this field of detection engineering and threat detection and scaling what it means to build a program like that. And I really wanted a place to go to read more about this, and I couldn't really find anything. So I started just collating a bunch of sources. I got really good at working through my Feedly and my social media, started writing my own analysis of these different topics, and then I put it out in a newsletter. And it just kind of took off from there. I gotten really good feedback on it. I've had a lot of people tell me how useful it's been, and I don't really know what to do when someone tells me that. I feel very honored, but also kind of awkward at the same time too. It's a little surreal at times.
Yeah. And can you share how many subscribers you have on that newsletter now?
Yeah, I think last time I checked, we're at 8,900. So we'll hit 10K by the end of the year, which is the magical number in newsletter land, I would say.
Yeah. And it's kind of fascinating to think there's that many people working in this industry that seemed so small not that long ago, right?
It is. And, one of the things that I used to benchmark this is I went and looked at a couple Twitter profiles and YouTube channels. And I realized a lot of people follow big influencers like John Hammond or Florian Roth, who do a lot of work in this space. And I'm like, if I can get 5% of their followers, I have a successful newsletter. So we're on our way.
Yeah. And how do you curate that? Is that just stuff that piques your attention, or do you have collaborators, or how does that work?
Yeah. So most important thing is scheduling. I schedule time to just sit down and focus and look through this stuff, especially with the family. Second, I use a lot of social media, Slack, Reddit. Feedly is a great tool for all kinds of article curation. And basically what I do is every morning I sit down before work, I drink my cup of coffee, I pick out ones that look really interesting. I read about 3 in the morning, and then I maybe write an analysis on one, and that kind of builds my backlog, and then it adds it over time into every issue.
Okay. Yeah. So just that consistency and making the time for it every morning.
Yeah. I've gotten lucky too, where I had the privilege that people now send me stuff. So, whether it's folks from your side that are talking about this on your website for LimaCharlie or other independent researchers, I get a good influx of stuff now too. And, I usually have some reliable sources of people that write about this a lot that I can kind of cheat and kind of take, and I know it'll be good.
Awesome. Yeah, we have an Intel channel specifically in our community Slack, and that's where I get a lot of our content from. So
exactly.
Totally
yeah, it's nice.
Awesome. The power of community, right?
Seriously.
All right. So to the topic at hand, to get started, maybe can you give us an overview of your background in security detection and research?
Yeah. I started in the field 2012. I worked for the DoD. And I got a really big interest on the classified side of what intelligence means. I think back then, right around the APT-1 report, that's when it got dropped, 2012, 2013. I'm oh my gosh, you could do this full time.
Yeah.
And so, after that job, I went and worked for a startup that specialized in cyber threat intelligence. And I just started from there. I really enjoy looking at how threat actors think and the decisions they make and what things they're abusing. There's just something almost like watching CSI, I guess, or, one of those serial killer documentaries where you're just why do you think like that? Why did you do it this way? Yeah. And so it just started from there. And I really stumbled into threat detection afterwards, because a lot of the times when I would deliver this intelligence, the next question I would get from customers is, well, what do I do? How do I find this happening in my environment? And so I had to get really good at saying like, hey, here's some proactive controls, but here's some reactive controls like detection. And it just really clicked with me to connect intelligence and detection in one. And I've been doing it ever since.
And that's really like intelligence feeds into detection, and it's useful for big corporations and organizations because you can kind of see what the latest techniques being used by adversaries are and sort of get ahead of them if they're targeting people in your field.
That's right. Yeah. It's making sure that like one, you're proving the value, and one way to prove the value of what you're doing is to kind of show like, here's the bad stuff that's happening. And if you can kind of showcase your coverage from that, that's like, it's worth its weight in gold to a lot of CISOs, right? And so having a good team behind that, a good product, a good tech stack, it really gives like a sense of comfort. But at the end of the day, all threat detection is a hedge. It's a hedge against your protective controls failing, and it's a necessary hedge, right? So, proving value is really important there.
Yeah, and that's actually something I think a lot of people struggle with is trying to show the value of the security programs they've built. Is there specific KPIs or measures that you use as a detection engineer to show that you're providing value to the organization?
There's a couple, and I've been thinking about this a lot, kind of tying back to Intel like we just talked about. But basically, the high level, like easy answer would be my stakeholders are happy. The question I would have next for someone is like, well, who are your stakeholders? And if you can kind of showcase like, hey, I talked with the finance team, I talked with the IT team, I talked with the team that manages like our servers, like the sysadmins, and they feel a sense that like we're looking into the things they need us to look into because they don't have that expertise. That's a very good qualitative measure.
Right.
On the quantitative side, I do everything from how many incidents have resulted in our rules, how many incidents have resulted in someone disclosing to us, so what's that ratio? What's the false positive ratio of some of our rules? What's the true positive ratio? How long did it take for us to look at a rule or an alert rather and say, hey, this is an incident or this is not an incident? And you could basically add that up into capacity. And then from that capacity, you can say like, hey, this is about how much we're costing. But if an incident ever happens, here's how much that'll cost instead.
Yeah.
And so like people are generally pretty good at looking at two things or holding two things and saying one weighs heavier than the other, right? So like it's a pretty obvious choice there.
Okay. And back to threat intelligence for a minute. One thing I'm curious about is how do you filter out the noise? There seems to be a lot of clickbaity articles out there. And, if I was going to believe all of them, it would seem like the sky's falling and everything's on fire. But a lot of times I feel like they're not that big of a threat.
It's a great question because I feel like I was part of a little bit of that clickbaity stuff working at a cyber threat intel firm.
Sure.
The first thing I say is just like people are just trying to, put dinner on the table, like get a paycheck. They have to publish these things if they work for a product company. But, I think a good understanding of your tech stack is going to go a long way of whether or not some of these intel reports are relevant. So here's an example. Being aware of the biases associated with like something shiny. So like a new nation state report drops, nation state threat report, and they do all this stuff and they target NGOs in the Philippines. And you're like, well, I don't think I'm an NGO in the Philippines, so I think I can put this away, right? But a lot of people obsess over it, right? And so a good understanding of your tech stack is important, but also aware of your biases, and the biases that can come with the shininess of threat intel can go a long way.
In that, when that threat intel comes into the organization, how important is the collaboration? Like they're different department than detection engineering. How do those two people generally share that information and operationalize it?
Yeah, so here's what we do at Datadog. We have a threat intelligence team that sits in the same organization as our detection team. And that threat intelligence team actually embeds with the detection team. They onboard the same way as our detection engineers. They go to the same meetings. They read the same release notes of the rules they're working on. We even get them to write detections. And I feel like when it comes to collaboration, the best thing that you can do is to set somebody up to feel the pain of somebody else. You coming from a product company should know this. You know the pain your customers and your prospects are feeling, and that's the best way you can relate to them. So having the intelligence team feel that pain and then kind of take that back and say, well, based on the pain I know that they feel, our tech stack, as well as our intelligence requirements, here's like how I can separate the wheat from the chaff and really make sure that I can give timely intelligence reports that they can action on and add to their backlog.
Very cool. And I guess you guys all celebrate together as well when
Of course.
things are stopped. Yeah.
Got to celebrate together. Writing's a good way to do that. We have like brown bag lunches where sometimes we'll talk about a threat we found or a cluster that we're tracking, and it's the intel team, it's the CERT, it's the detection team, and everyone feels like it's one like better together story, and it's not these like really siloed off places.
Okay. Cloud security is another area where you have a lot of expertise, and I think it's a big concern for a lot of organizations. I think you'd be very hard pressed to find a major organization that hasn't moved most of their stuff into the cloud. What are some of the unique challenges that come with this new environment compared to the traditional on-premise type security concerns?
Yeah, I think about this a lot from the shared responsibility model. So a lot of the cloud service providers talk about, like, when you transition to the cloud, here's how we handle security. I think Google calls it the shared fate model. Amazon calls it shared responsibility. But the basic premise is that there's almost like it feels like a social contract that gets initiated when you get onto a cloud that says the cloud provider will protect the data center. They'll protect the keys that are on maybe the TPM device. And then they basically draw a line. And from that line, they say, okay, you're responsible for this part. Good luck. And I think over the years, they've gotten much better at saying, like, hey, it's not as cut and dry as that. Let's work together. But what makes it so interesting is that when you start to see how threat actors abuse that shared responsibility model, and how almost always the solution to that abuse is buying more stuff on the cloud providers. And you're like, wait a second. Like, I feel like this is working out for you guys way more than it's working out for me, right?
Yeah.
And so seeing that abuse, seeing, whether it's a crypto miner or somebody smash and grabbing a blob storage bucket from Azure and ransomwaring it, it's just something that I think a lot of people are worried about. But because Wall Street calls them hyperscalers. They don't call them cloud providers. They call these hyperscalers. They're hyperscaling so fast. Not even the hyperscalers are aware what the bad guys can be doing to these things before they can give a good recommendation.
Are there common vulnerabilities or mistakes that cloud architects make that you see, like low-hanging fruit?
Yes. Oh my gosh. MFA. That's a huge one. Like, it's funny, and we keep saying it, and we keep seeing it, right? So about 80% of the incidents we've responded to at Datadog were the result of a long-lived access key or some type of credential that the threat actor basically discovered. So both of those things either skip MFA, like a long-lived access key, or because it's a cloud credential, they can just log into it, and then they can either do everything from abuse them through like push fatigue, or people just don't even have it turned on.
Right.
So that's a big one. Another big one that we see are just like over provisioned accounts. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is my favorite acronym in cloud: identity and access management. Basically, do you have the privileges you should have for you to do your job? And for the most part, the answer is almost always no. In the worst sense possible. So we see a lot of people that they get owns, and they happen to be, through some attack path, be an administrator to that cloud account, and then it's a complete takeover. And so getting an understanding on how identity works, and how to do these common misconfiguration type of fixes and tracking that, we spend a lot of time looking at that with customers, and it's something I compare notes to with like friends in the community as well.
Yeah, and I've often thought that these cloud providers are trying to hyperscale, they're trying to sell things, and so everything's made to really work easily when you're first setting it up. And I think people make some assumptions that it must be secure because they've handled all the configuration, but it's really just been set up to work, not be secure. And they have to go in and read the doc and follow best practices and take the time to harden things.
That's right. And it's a common trope, when a dev has a choice between securing something versus delivering a product, like their bosses are almost always going to say, please deliver the product, right?
Yeah.
I'm seeing a little bit of a change with that, at least in places like Microsoft, where the CEO came in and said like, no, security is our number one thing. So hopefully that changes, but it's like a runaway train at this point. It's so fast at delivering things that security is not necessarily an afterthought. It's just like the time complexity of getting it to the exact secure state that you want is not worth the trade-off with delaying the product release.
Yeah, and then keeping track of everything as it just the sprawl grows.
It's insane. I've seen some pretty insane cloud environments just from a complexity perspective. Datadog has one of the biggest Kubernetes cluster deployments in the world.
Wow.
I remember there's an internal tech talk when I first started at Datadog, and nothing bad, but basically this engineer got up and said, like, we're one of the first like customers in this cloud provider where the cloud provider ran out of IP addresses to give us. And people started laughing, and with the straightest face possible, he was like, it's not funny. That was really hard to solve. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Like,
you could tell that aged him a few years.
It did. It very much did. So,
All right. So we've talked cloud. The other area that you sort of have some deep knowledge is around DevOps. Is there ways that you integrate security into the software engineering and DevOps process that you think are worth sharing?
Yeah. I think that what we do at Datadog and what I do like internal security wise is we try to integrate as much as possible in the software development lifecycle. And so it's basically, if you can assume that devs have things that they need to be doing, products they need to be delivering, what is the least amount of friction that you can introduce into their workflows that has a good payoff in security? And so CI/CD is a place where we do a lot of work on everything from vulnerability scanning to misconfiguration scanning, making sure things don't get out into the cloud, like Terraform resource that gets out that's misconfigured. And they appreciate that. And they appreciate it even more, especially if you can basically automate it and then say, like, this is what you need to do to fix it. Yeah. Anytime, and I've seen it time and time again, some security person comes in, they're just like, nope, I'm going to change their minds. They're going to want to do security first because it's the right thing to do. And they put in this awful guardrail that just completely kills productivity. I just have to like pour one out for them and say, that's another one, someone that they just need to learn now that like, it's all about like being better together. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with the Terraform example that you just gave, you're talking about like the operational continuity as another security concern versus like an outside threat actor. That's also a part of this DevOps process. Security.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And, we've been exploring some ways to kind of get a lot of our threat processes earlier in the life cycle. I believe it was, I recently listened to a podcast. I put it on my one of my recent newsletters, but basically they had this really cool setup where someone had a software engineer at their company would want to put a service into production. So there's usually like a checklist, like do this checklist and you can go into production. Part of that checklist was talk to the security analytics bot on Slack and make sure your logs are configured so we can ingest them. And it was this completely like LLM powered thing that basically said like, hey, show me a sample log. And then would come back and say, it would be really great if you just added these 3 fields so it can go and make it easy for us to do threat detection. Like, here's the code to do it. Yeah. And they would just copy, paste it, and move on. And I thought that was a really brilliant way to add something other than a preventative control early in the software development lifecycle.
Yeah, interesting application of LLM too. I know a lot of organizations struggle. They can see that there's some potential here, but what is it, and how do we use it to make our lives better? That sounds like a good example.
I feel like it's good at summarizing. So you show up maybe to like a security incident, or you want to get up to speed on something. It's good at summarizing. It's good at like putting you in the right direction. I don't think I trust it with my car keys, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's too scary for me.
I've been exploring RAG searching. It's uses embedding process, and again, the hallucinations make it hard to actually do something for you with 100% surety that it's going to work. But using the search to pull up doc and information that we know is accurate has proven to be an interesting use case.
Yeah, I got to play around with that more. I feel like this is such an untapped area in threat detection. The funny thing, like, I don't know if you do this. Do you use like Claude or ChatGPT?
I'm
Like,
using the OpenAI API right
OpenAI,
now.
yeah. Are you polite with ChatGPT, or are you a little mean? Like, or
Sometimes I get mean when it's not giving me what I want. Eventually, I let some of that frustration out into the command line. Yeah, I'll say please sometimes too, though. So
I
yeah.
say please. I don't know
Yeah,
why I say
yeah.
please. And then there are times, like I was going through a CTF, and there was like some Linux kernel challenge. I'm like, you're a Linux kernel dev, you're an expert. Like, I am like not an expert, but you need to tell me what to do. And like, I made a game of saying like, you have 100 points, and if you go to 0 points, like, I'm not talking to you anymore, and you lose the game. And it started like getting a little uneasy. And then afterwards, I realized, like, is this abuse? Like, am I abuse?
Yeah. I know mathematically that it is not thinking. Really,
Yes. Yes.
it's following the statistical most likely path to return an
Yeah.
answer, but it
Yeah.
is hard not to put some human emotion into it.
That's right. That's right. But I don't know. Like, how do we even know? Are we just some AI model? So that's the thing I get freaked out about. Maybe it's just watching too much like sci-fi movies and things, like too much Star Trek, and I know what the outcomes are.
Yeah. And I think statistically, it's more likely that we're living in a simulation than actual reality. So there's
There you
always
go.
that. Yeah.
There you go. So maybe we'll be measured on how nice we were to the AI models that we're developing now in
Yeah.
our simulation. So
Yeah. The one that computers are good at not forgetting.
yes, that's right.
Okay, so back to it. Can you talk about the concept of shift left security and sort of what that means for our listeners and the importance in modern DevOps practice?
Yeah, so shift left is kind of what I talked about with the software development lifecycle, right? It's like the cost of a misconfiguration or a vulnerability or something that can really hamper the security of your organization is a lot more the closer it gets to production, or the closer it gets to like what your customers interact with. And so if you can catch what that looks like in your CI/CD pipelines, in your containers, in your code, maybe in your IDE itself, that cost is reduced to almost nothing, right?
Right.
And so shifting left is what you see a lot of. Like, I went to RSA. I think you were there too. I saw a lot of shift left stuff. I may have seen one shift right as well, So like, of course, now we got to go in the other direction.
Yeah.
But it's just a convenient way to kind of say, like, where in the software development lifecycle can you integrate, and can you introduce security so it doesn't cost your company a lot more with like incident response retainers and things like that.
Right. So really just like trying to elevate security as a first class consideration at every step of the development process.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But the key there is doing it as frictionless as possible, like I said
Right.
before. So, and that's the hard part,
Yeah. Yeah, competing interests, and ultimately if the business isn't making money, you can't pay for security. So yes, you have to get to market fast, but you also have to do it securely. So just lots of trade-offs and diplomacy.
Exactly. Lots of stakeholder management and making sure that like you're viewed as somebody that's not an adversary to like your own coworkers, know. And I think that the security world I was brought up in, I feel like old school hackers had a little bit of this, and there's still some of it now, of like, we're the best, we're the smartest, we know exactly what we're doing. And then I joined a startup and I realized I didn't know anything. And, that kind of humbled me. But at the same time, like, I realized we do have a long way to go as a community,
Yeah, and when I set out and studied computer science, I never thought I'd be worried about the quality of my microphone and my camera.
Yeah.
But also didn't realize like how much human to human communication skills were going to be a part of my career success working in
That's right.
technology. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's
right.
a team sport. Yeah. All right. So what are the most innovative approaches or technologies you've seen in detection engineering recently? Is there anything that sort of caught your attention?
Yeah. A couple of things. I feel like, and LimaCharlie's to me like an EDR kind of company here as well. I'm seeing a lot more blog posts of people unveiling how EDRs work and trying to bypass them. And so, especially on the Windows side, there's been some really interesting research on like all types of like callback functions and disabling EDRs like on the process callback stack to make sure that like you can either send in dummy data to the hooked EDR function or not. So that's been really cool because I think from a detection perspective, like that's when it gets like really meta. Like you're trying to detect the thing that affects the thing that you're trying to detect, you know? So it's like a little mind-boggling to think about. And I think people have a real craving of doing more detection like as code. So I feel like that concept's been out for like 4 or 5 years, but I'm starting to see a lot more even products offerings now, but they're still open source of, can I kick off an attack, emulate an attack in my CI/CD pipeline? Maybe it'll open up AWS, do something to an S3 bucket, close it, wait for that attack to generate an alert and see if that alert has the right fields configured, has the right context, has the right threat intel enrichment, and don't deploy the rule until you see that. And I think that's super, super interesting because it basically removes all of the testing you have to do once the rule goes out. And you could scale that a lot more, where you're doing a lot of different tests, a lot of different attacks, a lot of different rule deployments, and you're almost guaranteeing it's looking for the thing you told it to look for, and it's showing up in a format that you want it to show up in. And so those two have been interesting me a lot lately, just from a pure threat detection. One is like attacking the sophistication of EDRs, and one is like, what can we do more in CI/CD pipelines with detection?
Almost like a test-driven development for detection rules or something.
That's right. Yeah, I just put out a newsletter issue yesterday. David Burkett was talking about this, where he's like, I'm starting to see a lot more of like threat detection, like test-driven threat detection.
Yeah.
And he's really excited to see where that goes.
Yeah, huge fan of David Burkett. He's actually going to be at Mission Control again this year, our conference in Arlington. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm excited to see that. I've watched a lot of those videos, and so they really make my job easy watching those and adding them to the newsletter. So.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so do you have any advice for someone who's early or starting out in security detection in research?
I do, and I think that what I'm at least seeing as like a hiring manager, as somebody that goes and builds out these orgs, is that there has been a lot more of a focus on software engineering. Now, I'm not saying you need to be a trained computer scientist, but if you want to have a good breadth of options of places you want to go and do detection engineering in, make sure that you are very comfortable with coding to the point where you could build something to prove like something works. You don't have to be a software engineer. You don't have to build a hugely scalable system that a bunch of people can go and jump on and it stays reliable. But just focusing on like a very thin sliver of like threat research without having that corresponding coding component, your options are a lot less limited. So that would be like my biggest advice to somebody, is make sure that you're aware of GitHub. You know how CI/CD works. You know how to write some tests. You know how to deploy something simple to like a container or an AWS or something like that. That it goes a long way.
Yeah, and I've said that for years. I think the future of cybersecurity looks a lot more like software engineering than it does now.
It does, yeah. I'm seeing some resume. Like we have an intern right now, and I swear, like they're seniors in college, and they've done more stuff in their internships, and by the time they're 20 than I did in like the first 8 years of me being in professional like cybersecurity. They're all software engineers and they just have an interest in cybersecurity. So they're coming to take over, and I feel okay about the future.
Yeah, that's right. Saying. Yeah, and like with tools like Copilot and ChatGPT and stuff, like they're really multipliers for coding ability and productivity. Yeah.
I'm interested in your thoughts on that, because I like it. I think I've seen some people that are purists that are like, I would never ever do that. And I'm like, I don't know. I will take any tool I can get to get the job done. You know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, I feel that way too. And it's like a lot of the lower, not even lower level, the sort of the end stage part of the programming, like writing a function that sorts an array or something like that. Yeah, I can do that. But I'm very happy to ask ChatGPT or Copilot to produce that for me because I can look at it and know it works, and I didn't have to spend that labor and time producing it, right?
That's right. You could focus on the things that like are net new or require a lot of focus rather than, I don't know if boilerplate's the right word, but I've seen that come up a few times too, where like, all right, I've done this sorting algorithm before. Just give me something so I can focus on what I need to focus on.
And I find it's a really great tool for learning as well. I do a lot of sort of the web-facing stuff, and there's so many new frameworks. The JavaScript world just moves so fast, and if I don't understand something, I'll drop a snippet in there and like, what does the flag mean on this function call or something? And instead of having to dig through documentation, I get a very succinct explanation with like an example and can kind of move forward while maintaining that flow state.
And you don't have to go down that Stack Overflow rabbit hole where one person describes the exact problem you're looking for, and then he's posts again saying, I fixed it, but he didn't say what he did. You're like, no.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Yeah.
Are there any resources, books, or tools you recommend for those interested in deepening their knowledge in this field?
There's a few. I think that from an open source perspective, I really like the Sigma project. If you really want to deep dive on all types of threat detection rules from all different types of sources, writing rules that are in like a vendor agnostic format. It's even in YAML. It's not necessarily code. That's a great place to go to. There's a couple labs, and you can find a bunch of them on GitHub. Just type in detection engineering. I think Eric has a really good lab.
Yes.
As well. His is super, super good, and I've seen a lot of people talk about how helpful that one was.
I think it's so you want to be a SOC analyst.
That's right. Yeah, That's a great one. And what a place to start too to become detection engineering, because you're the customer of a detection engineer. You feel the pain, and then you transition over, and you know exactly what you need to do.
Yeah, and I love seeing people leverage that article to learn on LimaCharlie. We have a pretty generous free tier, and it's cool to be contributing to that, right?
Yeah. I feel like open source has come a long way. Community editions for products have come a long way too, and it's such a great field that you can get access to like products like that where it's not running on like some Nuck box that's like 10 years old. Like it is running in someone's cloud, and you can get what you need for the most part from it. So
very cool. Okay, so the last one I have for you, it's the one that I ask everyone that comes onto the show. It can be as wide or as narrow as you want. Do you have any predictions for the future of cybersecurity?
Let's see. Oh, this one stumped me last time too. And I read this and like, I know I'm going to have something. I think LLMs and generative AI is here to stay. And I think that we're 2 to 3 years out from someone talking about maybe at a DEF CON or a Black Hat, the first SOC that's like 80% managed by an AI. And like it being somewhat reliable, which is like kind of scary to think about, right?
Yeah.
So that's my prediction.
Okay. Yeah. And I can't wait. I don't know if you caught it at the end of last year. I did like a summary episode that was just everybody's predictions, and it was super fascinating with a little bit of hindsight to hear everybody's predictions. But I don't think you're wrong. I think AI is not going to replace humans, but it's going to make one person be able to do more and more. Like you're always going to need the human in the loop, but it's going to be superpowers.
Yeah. I think it's going to be superpowers. I don't see it as a replacement or a substitute, So it's going to raise like the bar so that we can really use our brain power on the things that matter.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me again, Zach.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was awesome running into you, by the way.
Oh, down at RSA. Yeah. My favorite thing about going to those things, I don't like the plane travel. I don't like the food. I never sleep well in the hotels, but I get to see all these awesome people in person. So
yeah. That was a great party. I feel like it was like a cool way to see a lot of people that I either like link their podcasts or their blog posts or things like that all in one spot. So it was just like really, really awesome to kind of put names and faces in real life,
Awesome. And I got a Security Detection Engineering Weekly sticker on my laptop.
You did? Oh, yes. Okay. You put it on your laptop. Perfect. That's awesome.
Great, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.